So today's video is going to focus on photosynthesis, okay? And we're going to really be looking at the chemical reaction that's involved here with photosynthesis. There's going to be plenty of details associated with that reaction, but don't lose sight of the big picture, okay? Always keep in mind our basics of what goes in, what comes out of photosynthesis. Okay, so let's talk a second about energy. Okay, energy is required for life, the ability for the organism to bring energy in, as well as to then harness, use, convert that energy. So we have heterotrophs, which are animals. We are a great example of a heterotroph. We have to ingest food. So we have to take in energy. We cannot essentially create our own. We're an autotroph, like a plant. Auto is self, hetero is other, so I'm other feeding. Troph is feeding, auto is self-feeding. So self-feeding, or plants, autotrophs here, they're going to create their own food. Essentially, that creation of food is just a conversion of energy. So if you look at the cycle at the bottom here, you'll see I've got an energy input that needs to happen. That's going to be used to help form ATP. I'm going to release energy to help power my organism, to help move it forward, to help break other things down, to help make proteins, right? I'm going to have this energy release. And it's just a constant circle, constant circle, constant circle, constant circle. And so what plants do is they essentially create that energy input themselves, and they are not required to eat food to get that energy input. So we're going to focus on the plant, obviously, and bringing this light energy in. So for the plant to have this input of energy, it's got to be able to collect the light energy, and it has to be able to store it. So it has to be able to do both of those things. So it's going to be able to collect it using the chlorophyll, the pigment that makes the plants green. That's going to help collect that light energy. It can store that light energy as glucose, or as the sugars, but it's also going to need the building blocks from the environment to make that glucose. Remember, glucose is a sugar, so it's going to contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So I've got to be able to get those materials from the environment. So carbon dioxide, you can see, is going to come from the air here. I'm going to be able to get some hydrogen there from the water. And then these nitrogen, potassium, phosphates, that's all referring to when the plant is making proteins and making new nucleic acids, not storing the energy as glucose. Okay, so the plant's producing all of these organic molecules. The one we're focused on right now is the production of the carbohydrates from photosynthesis. So as we mentioned before, the plant's has to be able to obtain that light energy, or get that light energy from the sun. So the leaves is where we're going to find our highest concentration of chlorophyll, which again is the pigment that's going to help. It's different than a chloroplast, right? The chlorophyll is the pigment that's going to absorb that light energy. The CO2 is also going to come in through the leaves. The stomates, or stomata, these are little pores on the underside, so on the bottom side of the leaf. And this is where gas exchange is going to happen. So in a plant's case, right, I've got CO2 coming into the plant, and oxygen leaving the plant through those stomates, or through those openings on the bottom of the leaf. Water is going to come from the roots, right? The plant's going to take up water from the soil using the roots, and that water will get transported through the roots, up the shoots, all the way up to the leaf, where it can get used in the leaf there. And then most of the other any other nutrients that the plants need to make, again, the proteins, the nucleic acids, the lipids, that's all going to come from the roots as well. Our focus right now, though, is making the carbohydrate. Okay, so let's look at some more pictures of this as we can kind of zoom in on this a little bit. So the one, let's kind of follow this here. Let's start in this upper right-hand corner, right? This is a cross section of a leaf, and we've pulled out just this little part of the leaf here. Okay, so on the top of the leaf, we have the cuticle. Again, we're going to do plants as their own separate unit. Our focus right here is going to be, you can see all these chloroplasts within the leaf. All of these things here are chloroplasts in the leaf here. Okay, and on the underside of the leaf is where you're going to find those stomata. So the chloroplast is where the photosynthesis is actually going to happen. And that chloroplast is going to contain the chlorophyll. So if you come down to this right here, okay, so you can see all the chloroplasts here in all these little plant cells, all these little green things here. Those are going to contain the chlorophyll for trapping the light energy, and then where the whole reaction of photosynthesis will occur. The stomata, you can see a stomate here down at the base. Remember this, it's the little pore or the little hole, the opening on the bottom side. The stoma, let's come up now to this picture in the upper left. You can see the gas exchange occurring here. The stoma, they look like a little mouth when you look at them through a microscope, which we're going to look at. The stoma is the actual opening or the hole, and it is surrounded by what we call a guard cell. And the guard cell, you can see in this picture on the upper left too, around the edges here. So the guard cell controls whether that stoma is open or closed, because if it's really dry out, water, you'll notice water also leaves through that stomata. So through the stoma, I've got water and oxygen leave. Water does not come in through that, right? Water comes in through the roots and CO2 goes in. So if it's really hot, if it's really dry out and those stomata are open, the plant's losing a lot of water. So the plant does need to be able to regulate whether those are open or closed. And the guard cell will do that. The guard cell will control whether those are open or closed, and will actually control that through osmosis. How full that guard cell is of water versus not. Okay, so that's these are kind of the parts of the plant that are going to be important in photosynthesis. So let's zoom in a little bit on the chloroplast now. Okay, so the chloroplast we talked about a little bit with the cell when we talked about the cell organelles and the cell parts. Remember the chloroplast, so this is the organelle, so it's membrane bound. It's found in eukaryotic cells, in particular plant cells. So it's the organelle where photosynthesis actually takes place. It has two membranes. Remember we talked about how membranes are helpful for allowing electron transport chains to form and chemical reactions to happen, and that's something that does need to happen during photosynthesis. So the chloroplast has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. It also has membranes within it. So each of these individual stacks individual coins in the stack is a thylakoid. So each one of these is a thylakoid. Okay? And then the whole stack, it's a little hard to see the black pen there. The whole stack is a granum. Okay? The multiple stacks is a grana. The liquid portion of the chloroplast is called the stroma. So that's going to be your basic structure. Some of the chemical reactions are going to take place on this thylakoid or the grana stacks. Okay? And then some of the chemical reactions will take place in the liquid portion of the stroma. Okay, let's talk about photosynthesis as a whole first. So first of all, I don't know why this little oxygen ended up over here. So let's put it. Okay, so how we mentioned before, don't lose sight of the big picture. This is our big picture equation of photosynthesis. So a couple of things real quick on chemical equations. Remember on the left side of the arrow here, these are my reactants. So those are the things that are going into the chemical reaction. And on the right side here, these are my products. These are what are coming out of the chemical reaction. So when we do photosynthesis, the reactants for photosynthesis are water, CO2 or carbon dioxide. It requires light, and then glucose, So a monosaccharide sugar here, glucose and oxygen are my products of photosynthesis. So always keep that big picture in mind. Those are the reactants I need to convert that light energy into those sugar products. And photosynthesis happens in kind of two major steps. What we call the light reactions, which are when the energy is actually converted. And we'll look at those more specifically in a little bit. You can see in this diagram to the side, I've got the light energy input happening in the light reactions. And you'll notice coming out of it is ATP. Right? I have a conversion of energy there from a light form to a chemical form. And then the Calvin cycle is where I'm really going to actually build the food, build those sugars that are used to store that energy now. So in another form of energy conversion, and these are light independent. You'll notice it doesn't require an input of light for these reactions to occur. And we'll look at those separately as well. Okay, so here's one of these times where I need you not to just blindly be writing down, and I need you to stick with me and maybe write down things when I talk about them. You can always pause and write it down at the end as well. Or if you really need to pause, write down what you want to write down right now, and then you can actually listen and add. Okay, so these light reactions, they're going to occur on those thylakoid membranes. So the light reactions, you can see the input of light is coming in, and they're occurring, they require those thylakoid membranes. So they require the input of light, and what will happen is the input of light is going to excite electrons. If you remember your parts of an atom and stuff, right, from middle school, you've got neutrons and protons in the nucleus, right, and the electrons are, out around the edge. Okay, so an input of light is going to cause the electrons to get excited. We'll do more detail with this when we go into AP biology. Okay, this is even a little bit more than you need officially for STAR, but again, we're not a STAR class, we're a pre-AP class, right? We're an honors class. We're trying to make sure we're ready for things. So the input of light is going to excite the electrons. Also, what will happen during that time is water will split. If we look at what a water molecule is made up of, right? If I split water, I'm going to have two hydrogens and I'm going to have an oxygen, right? So oxygen doesn't like to be by itself. So as soon as I split a second water molecule, those oxygens, they're going to find each other. And that's where I'm going to get that O2, and that's where I'm going to get that O2 product, right? If I go back again to my big picture, water, CO2 gives me glucose and oxygen. Well, here's where my oxygen came from. Here's my product. Here's my reactant, right? I used water, went in, oxygen came out. So you can see the oxygen coming out on the diagram there. Those hydrogen ions, if you look at the middle part of the diagram here, you'll see I have this NADPH molecule that cycles back to be an NADP plus molecule. The difference here being these hydrogens, right? Well, a hydrogen atom has one electron, one proton. So if I take an electron off of that hydrogen ion, off of that hydrogen atom, I end up with a single positive charge, right? And so now I have an electron, and a single positive charge. Okay, well, the benefit to this is now I can replace those excited electrons. So I had electrons that got excited. Think of them like jumping up and down, and they jumped so high they left the trampoline, right? Well, I've got to replace those electrons. So I can replace them with the electrons I pull from the hydrogen that came from the water. And now I have hydrogen ions. Well, hydrogen ions are important. Remember, I'm making a sugar in this Calvin cycle. That sugar, you'll notice, needs hydrogens. So I've got to get those hydrogens out to where that Calvin cycle is happening in the stroma. So the NADP plus is like a shuttle bus for hydrogens. So it carries those hydrogens over to the Calvin cycle so they can be used there. Okay? And then it's going to these things are going to get on and off the shuttle bus using electron transport chains. That's why these electrons are so important. Those electrons get excited and they go to the electron transport chain. So this essentially is powered by electrons moving through it. So I need electrons to come from somewhere. Well, electrons come somewhere from the sun, right? The light energy excites those electrons. They hop into that electron transport chain and they power it. And that electron transport chain is now going to create ATP and NADPH for that plant. So I used my water and I used my light and I produced my oxygen. Okay? All this is happening on the thylakoid membrane. So now let's shift over to the Calvin cycle out in the stroma and use the rest of the things. So now the Calvin cycle will occur. That occurs in the stroma, which is that liquid part of the chloroplast. This is a very simplified chloroplast here in your diagram. You'd have lots of those grana stacks of thylakoids there. So this is occurring in the stroma. It requires CO2. Remember, not losing sight of our big picture, right? Water plus carbon dioxide gives me those sugars plus the oxygen. Oops. Okay. So I already spit out oxygen in the light reaction from when I split the water. I already used water in the light reaction, right? I used the electrons from water to power the electron transport to replace the electrons that the light sent to the electron transport chain. I released the oxygen and I put the hydrogens on these shuttle buses in the NADPH and used the hydrogens to help make ATP. You'll notice ATP and NADPH aren't in my equation anywhere because they're recycled throughout, so they're not included in that equation. So now I still need to use the CO2 and I still need to produce the sugar. So the Calvin cycle is going to use the energy from that ATP and it's going to use the hydrogens from that NADP and it's going to use the carbons and the oxygens from the CO2 and it's going to produce sugars. Right? Again, those sugars are, and we're not going to get into detail on how it does it, right? But here's a carbon source from the CO2. Here's a hydrogen source at that NADPH, dropping those hydrogens off. Okay? And there's an oxygen source as well with that CO2. So I can combine, check, check, check. The cell does a chemical reaction controlled by enzymes, just like the light reaction. Chemical reactions are all controlled by enzymes. So this is controlled by enzymes. I now can rearrange those molecules into the sugar, and I use the CO2 that was needed. Remember that CO2 came in through the stomata. The oxygen there left through the stomata. Okay. So again, I know there's a lot of little details here that may not make complete sense. Draw the diagrams. We'll do some diagrams. We'll do some lab things. We'll work with this to help it all stick. Okay? But like I said before, let's go back to our big picture, right? Don't lose that big idea in the minutia of things, right? So the water that's going to be used in those light reactions, it's going to be split. Right, so I end up with the hydrogen, the oxygen, and the electrons. The electrons power the electron transport chain. The oxygen is lost out through those stomata during the light reaction. The hydrogens hop on those NADPHs to be used to build the glucose. Right, so the glucose is formed during that Calvin cycle. And the CO2 is needed during the Calvin cycle to provide that carbon and oxygen source to help make the glucose. Okay. Now, while the plant has made sugar, it has not made ATP yet. So when we do cellular respiration, you need to realize that the plant is doing that reaction as well. Plants are very busy. They do lots and lots of chemical reactions all the time. So remember, like always, make notes in your notes about what it is you didn't understand. Make sure they're clear so that when I see you again finally, so you can remember what the question was, so that we can clear up anything that you're having trouble with before we get started on activities.